So I'm going to revise a little bit what Dennis said. What we learned about selfless service, I think that Elizabeth and Kitty and Jane would have a comment or two to say something about our selfless service. But what we're going to talk about is how we learned about service from them. And they know about selfless service, and that's what they were trying to pass on to us. So the best part of the program, our talk, is going to be our show and tell, and so you're going to have to actually wait for that. But to begin with, there's this beautiful photograph of Elizabeth, Kitty, and Jane, and Mary thinks that this was taken during a community volunteers event. I don't remember it, but that's what she remembers. So that becomes...
Yeah.
It's Richard Blue's wedding.
Is that what it is?
Okay.
Okay, so that was selfless service, right? So,
On the part of who?
Elizabeth, Kitty, and Jane. So our theme is to serve with love. And the reason that that is our theme is that was the motto for this organization that brought Mary and me to Myrtle Beach, and that was Community Volunteer Services. And I'm going to mention a little bit about the history of CVS, because we have some of the history sitting with us as we speak. And you're not even that old, Pat.
I know, I was a baby. I was just 9.
So I'm going to use my notes from time to time. But so when I talk about Community Volunteer Services, I'm going to refer to it as CVS. It really was the original CVS, not to be mistaken with the drugstore CVS, but we called CVS from its beginning, right, Walter? I mean, so.
Dennis?
And so when I'm referring to CVS, you now know what I'm going to be talking about. And our experience in terms of what we know about service is really seen through the prism of being part of CVS and working with Elizabeth and Kitty and Jane during that time. So we have some new friends. I'm just going to mention, I'm preaching to the choir to most of you, but when we talk about Elizabeth and Kitty, we're talking about Baba's disciples. You know, Jesus had his disciples, and Mayor Baba had his disciples as well, and Elizabeth and Kitty were two of his first Western disciples, and they came to Baba in 1931. And they lived with Baba in India, and in the 40s, Baba asked Elizabeth to come and find a center somewhere in the United States for him, and Baba didn't specify where, and the stories are beautiful about how Elizabeth and Narina ended up here, but here they did. And we're actually sitting on, as you've heard before, some of the original property of the center when it was first given to Elizabeth for use for the center. And in fact, I actually have that's part of my show and tell today, and I didn't even realize it until I looked at it a few minutes ago. And Jane didn't live with Baba. She met Baba, she and Charles and Wendy and John met Baba in 1958, but Jane became an integral part of the center, much like Phyllis has as well. And I want to bring up Kitty as part of the story because Kitty really wasn't directly involved with community volunteer services and community services as we understood it with CVS. But her service is as meaningful as any service that can be given. And in fact, Baba talked in a discourse, described Kitty's service. Let me read it to you. A word that gives courage to a drooping heart, or a smile that brings hope and cheer in gloom, has as much claim to be regarded as service as onerous sacrifices and heroic self-denials. And if that doesn't describe Kitty to a T, nothing does. I mean, she absolutely was there for us with her smile, which we learned was absolutely contagious. And we always went to her with our gloom and left with her smile. So that was Kitty's contribution to our learning about service, and maybe the most important thing we learned. But going back to CVS and our work in the community, I'm almost to the brochure, but it was really Elizabeth and Jane who really were the inspirations to CVS. And I'm going to go into that, but what I want to talk about for a moment is Elizabeth's role in the community. And by community, I mean the Myrtle Beach community, because we don't really know that side of her, and it was because she really didn't talk about that side of her. I mean, that was her life, and it just came natural to her. But she had no need to broadcast it or to tell us that this is what we should be doing, but it is what she did. So, you know, her biography is wonderful, but when she came to Myrtle Beach, when she moved here, she was a faithful member of the First Methodist Church. And so every Sunday, without fail, she was sitting in her pew at the First Methodist Church. And I would like to think that it was the front row pew. It may not have been, but that's how I envision her at the First Methodist Church. And she was a member of the First Methodist Church. That was her church. Her heart was there as well. But she did more than just that. She was involved in the Myrtle Beach community. Some of us know that she was on the board of Myrtle Beach Farms, which was the company that her father started with the Burroughs brothers. And when her father passed away, she really took his seat on that board and helped guide the growth of Myrtle Beach Farms and Myrtle Beach through that position. She also was an integral part of the formation of the first hospital here, Ocean View Hospital. And some of us remember Ocean View. And it's now where Grand Strand General Hospital is, but originally it was Ocean View Hospital. And if you're ever in the hospital, God forbid, in the main waiting area, there's a glass case display area, and it has some of the history of the hospital there. And there's an Old Sun News newspaper with Elizabeth pictured on it, talking about her contribution to the formation of Ocean View Hospital. And not too long ago, this magazine came out called Myrtle Beach, a Retrospective, and it's about the history of Myrtle Beach. Now, strangely enough, it doesn't talk about the center, which is part of the history of Myrtle Beach, but that's another story. But it does mention Elizabeth again. And so this just came out of somebody's archives, not the center archives. But there's a picture of Elizabeth next to a fire truck, the Myrtle Beach fire truck. And it was with two other women, and it says, fulfilling a promise, Guy Cameron, Elizabeth Chapin Paterson, and Mrs. S.E. Lynn rode a fire truck after the community raised $150,000 in 1956 for Ocean View Memorial Hospital. So again, this is really Elizabeth, unknown to us in the Baba world, being part of the Myrtle Beach community. And so it's wonderful that these little things trickle out for us to learn from, because that's really the story of CVS and how it got started. And this is really now where Pat can help me with it. So we know Happy Club, and Happy Club really was the beginning of CVS, but Happy Club was hand in glove with a high school organization called Community Service Council.
Community Service Club. We weren't
Club.
fancy.
Okay. CSC, correct? And the founders of CSC were Charles, Wendy, I assume, Louise,
Harris. You?
and our own Pat. And this was in the mid-60s, 65, 66, something like that. And they recognized the need. They recognized in that time that there was a need for people to come together to bridge the racial divide and to render assistance where needed. And at one point they created a park in what we called the Harlem section. It's now the Canal Street section, but that was the Bathsheba Bowens Memorial Park. You were part of that.
Yes.
And you knew Bathsheba.
Yes.
She died in high school,
Yeah.
right?
Yes.
And so they gathered around her and to build this park. I said, this is a trip down memory lane for several of us, but we have a brochure of, is that right? That's right.
Got it.
Oh, that one there. So in a brochure that CVS put out later in its evolution, they had a little history here about CVS, and I want to read this to you.
And Jane wrote this.
Community Volunteer Services was chartered in 1968 as a nonprofit organization. The charter states it is the aim of the association to carry on exclusively charitable and educational programs, particularly for children of low-income families, and thereby to relieve human suffering, combat juvenile delinquency and community deterioration, and promote understanding and harmony among all people of the community. And it goes on to say the forerunner of CVS was an organization called the Community Service Club, founded in 1967 by a group of black and white high school students. CSC offered tutoring, summer recreation programs, and established Bathsheba Bowens Memorial Park for children. So it was really the children that shamed the parents into taking action. But one of the parents they shamed was Jane Haynes.
Exactly.
And she took the cue and she ran with it. And let me just say, in this original council club, I mean, there was Louise Garrison Trask. There was someone that you all don't know. Now his name slipped my mind, but he's the person that told Marshall, no, not Gary, it'll come to me in a minute, but he was Marshall's first mentioning of Mayor Baba at a Hardee's hamburger stand up in North Myrtle Beach.
Oh, really?
Yeah. I have it written down. Well, it will come to me. So, they start CVS, and our history, my history, Mary's history, Walter's history is that CVS was really started by Jane and Elizabeth, which is probably true. At one level, they were the real inspiration of making it come together. But this was really a realization of Baba's words, where he talked about how he came to bring together religions like beads on one string. CVS was really beads, the beads of all the churches on one string, including the center.
And the synagogue.
Because, and I'll read it in a minute, but the Catholic Church was heavily involved, the Jewish synagogue was involved, the Methodist Church was heavily involved, the Presbyterian Church was heavily involved, and each of them participated.
And all the African American churches.
Oh, well, yeah, Mount Olive, AME, Sandy Grove Baptist. I mean, that goes with that. They were already doing the work, so I don't mention them, but the white churches really were coming in and trying to figure out what to do. And that's how CVS came about. Now I have to,
Did you say synagogue too?
Yeah,
the
everything.
synagogue too, Bethel. So, because this is an important part of it, I want to go over the list of characters that played a part in CBS. This is Mary Clayton, but before Mary Clayton was Mary Clay McBride. She really was one of the first workers with CBS.
Mary Clay.
Mary Clay McBride, yeah. Then Dana Ferry took over after Mary, and then Mary Clay McBride, and then I took over after Dana. And even before I came, there was Walter. And Walter and Mary is going to tell some stories about the air base, and maybe you can fill in as well. Denny Moore, Cynthia Connor, Buzz's sister, Jerry Llewellyn, Stuart Baker, Ms. Barbara Plews, who was the president of CBS at one point, Price Branch, Lisa Sanford, Beth Cheney, I don't know if some of us remember Beth, Uta Bowman, Will David, Michael Teich, Josephine Hayes, Florence Child, going back in memory, Warren Hicks, Daryl and Susan Smith, Louise Smith, Stella Hernandez, Owen Cooper. I mean, and I probably have left some off the list, but that just goes to show what kind of impact CBS had by bringing all these, at that time, young people in. We'll even call Stella young and Lisa young. But they were so much a part of it, and we all were at that time. But the point that I want to bring home is that this was not started because Elizabeth and Jane said, we need to have another service project for the center. That was never their idea, never their goal. They just intuitively and spontaneously saw a need, and their heart took them to it. They had no choice. They had to do it. And I wish we had sat down and taken the story from Jane, but how she met the families that she met, that she created these deep ties with, that we still have contact with today. I mean, they still remember Jane and what an impact she had in their life. And at the end, I want to tell you an Elizabeth story along the same lines. But so my start with CBS was through Happy Club. How many of you participated in Happy Club over the years?
Phyllis, you did too.
And so what we would do is we'd be visitors on the center, and we were always invited on that Saturday to play with the children, to be there. Maybe most importantly, make peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. I just recall every Saturday from morning till afternoon making peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, right? That was the taste of CBS, of Happy Club at that time. So I now graduated from college, and I'm been applied to and accepted into the Peace Corps. Oh, I have to go back on my list of people who participated in CBS. Our own Dean Nordquist, who has his own stories, and if I could force him up here to tell them, he would, about We the People Sing, which was the major fundraiser of CBS one year, and it was a national bringing together of gospel singers into the and these were nationally known gospel singers.
Nine Boys of Alabama. Nine Boys of Alabama.
Well, Alabama would have loved to have been part of it. And Dean, you came down as the sound crew, right? You were part of, and the design crew?
Technically assistant to one of the producers.
Okay. And who was that?
That would be Fastback.
Okay. So this is Dean's claim. That wasn't your first time to Myrtle Beach, was it? It was your first time to Myrtle Beach. So this is the impact that was happening at that time. So I've graduated from college. I applied to the Peace Corps because I didn't know what else to do. And they assigned me to go to Jamaica. They had sent me my passport. They had sent me my airplane ticket. And I thought, well, I needed to come to the center one last time and say goodbye because it's a 2-year stint to go into the Peace Corps. And while I was here, I was saying goodbye to Jane, and she sort of got around to saying, well, if you're going to Jamaica not making money, why don't you come here and not make money? It had a ring to it. It just made absolute sense. How could you say no to that? And so I had to call up my Peace Corps contacts in Jamaica and say, thanks, but no thanks, I'm going to Myrtle Beach instead. So I came and I started at the exorbitant salary of $250 a month. That's a total of $3,000 a year. And Mary actually has a story about that. It's just a wonderful story. So that's how I began. I was what was called the family service director. My office was maybe the best office I ever had. It was in the back of my Barracuda. And so I would drive around, and this was before cell phones. I don't even think I had a phone then. And then Letha Hemingway, the spiritual mother of Grace Path, made this one room.
Let me pass that around. Oh, wait, I'll bring it to you.
This one room little
Sorry.
mission church in her backyard that she said, why don't you use this as your office? And that became the office of CBS. And there was a little placard in this one room mission church that we were using. And it said, be ye doers of the word and not hearers only. And I thought how perfect that was for us. Be ye doers of the word and not hearers only. So that's what we were trying to do. And I can tell you that I didn't know how to do it, and Mary didn't know how to do it. We were just
How
out of
can
college.
he speak for me?
Let me just say that again. So that was my beginning. And now, since I can't speak for Mary, I'm going to turn it over to her.
Thank you all for the opportunity to come and talk about.
Closer.
Thank you all for the opportunity to come and share today. Because I don't know what it was that happened, but it happened to all of us or we wouldn't be in this room in some way or another. And this is just some of the ways. And what I was thinking about with Kitty and Elizabeth and Jane was, what was it about them? And because Elizabeth and Kitty had been through all that training with Baba, and they'd gone through so much, when we were with them, it was unconditional. And it was safe, it was scary. And when we messed up or something happened that we hadn't anticipated, there was no blame. And those characteristics, and there was a living of them living integrity in the sense of they didn't change. They were the same. They were consistently loving Baba, and they've been through so much. To work with them, they didn't tell you what to do. But what would happen is, I can remember I was in California and I was doing meditation, and this monk would whip you on the back if you kind of dozed, you know? And I saw a picture of the wisteria on the center in bloom. I'd never seen purple flowers like that. And my boyfriend, who was my Baba contact, and I hitchhiked from California to Florence in the back of a Ryder truck. A band picked us up, and they were going to give something in DC, so they dropped us off in Florence in the middle of the night. And we came to the center on the bus, And I thought that when you went through the green gate, the old green gate before we got this new entrance, if you didn't get God realized, you were so messed up. There wasn't a chance. And I didn't get anything. And I was terrified. Really. I thought, this is no good. You know? I'm not prepared, or I'm not capable, I'm not loving enough, whatever. Then they took us over to meet Elizabeth. Now, when I met Elizabeth, and we all have our own stories of meeting different people that really were powerful in our lives, I felt like she could see all the way through me and everything in me. And I loved it, and I was terrified of it at the same time. And that was the beginning of my experience with them. So we were on the center, we had hitchhiked, and Jane came up to us and said, listen, we're gonna run this thing on the air base, and it's a volunteer summer camp. Walter was in it. And why don't you all come back this summer and help us with it? And we said, well, can we live on the center? And Jane said, yeah.
Think about this.
Okay, so we thought, well, we'll have a place to live, we'll just have to get our own food and we'll volunteer. Well, then Jane went and told Elizabeth what she said. Elizabeth was, nobody lives on the center. But she said, because you made a promise, we have to keep the promise. So we all got to live on the center for the summer. And we would either drive in one of the cars that was Elizabeth's or Jane's, or we would get on the buses with the Air Force Base. And the Air Force Base would take their buses and go get the kids in Harlem, in the pig pen on the hill, and in Race Path. And pick up the kids, and then we would, some of us would be on the bus, and then we run a program all day. We taught them how to swim in the pool, bowl. We did all kinds of games. We did all kinds of teamwork stuff. It was exhausting. It was hard. Half the time we didn't know what we were doing, but it worked. And it was that experience, plus they had this flea market every year. The flea market was for the clinic. And the clinic was 2 days a week. It was in the old fire station. Mary, Clay, and Dana, and some of the other people would go get the people who needed a doctor. CVS had a volunteer doctor. And then the money we'd raise at this flea market, where all the churches in the community, all the women's groups of the churches worked together. They all had a different booth. And they raised $10,000 in one day at the convention center. And we would work the whole year to get all the stuff. And we'd have a warehouse down on 10th Avenue, and we'd just fill it with stuff. And then each church would have a booth, and they would set it up, and in one day, we would make that much money. And then that money would go towards the medicine those people needed, and then the project of, which became Friendship House Clinic, and Neighborhood House, which became the school we started, and other programs that CBS had. Did I do that all right?
You did a beautiful job.
So let me tell you, he was a little 19-year-old, or no, 21-year-old. I was 4 years older. We didn't know what we were doing, but that didn't matter. They didn't care. What they responded to intuitively was our hearts. So we didn't have to have any credentials, but we were trying to love Abba. That was powerful, very powerful. So I can remember we did this air base thing, and then through that flea market, we met all the women's groups and all the churches, and everybody knew each other. And Eckerd Drugs was the guy that ran the drugstore that would give us the best prices on the drugs. So the whole community was connected. You didn't go someplace and not see people you knew. Now this was brilliant, right? Because out of that was all based on relationships. And because Elizabeth was so loved in the community, and her father before her, and Jane was a writer, and we get everything in the newspaper, people trusted us. And through the flea market, we all got to know each other. So they let us do things because of Jane and Elizabeth and Kitty that we could have never gotten near if it wasn't for them. So I can tell you that there was a cohesiveness, there was a kind of integrity. There aren't words to express what it was like to be around them, and it was scary. So one day, I decided I went back after we did the air base, and I was living with this guy in a commune in Minnesota.
I don't want to go this.
And this was after the summer, you know, and it had been wonderful. And I get up there, and this guy is a beautiful guy, but it just isn't working. And so one night, I go out under the stars, and I know you're not supposed to do this, but I didn't. I was so desperate. You know when you're sick of yourself, and your own problems are driving you crazy, and you need relief? Big time. I said to Baba, okay, look, if you help me get out of this relationship, I will work for you. I'll serve you, and maybe I can get better, you know. So within 2 days, I was on a bus to Chicago to see my parents. And then I came down to the center, stayed for a little bit. It was a Sunday, and I saw John and Charles and Ginny, Caleb, Zenner, all walking by after Baba's house by the lagoon cabin. And I just see him, John, just walking by. And I'm standing by the lagoon cabin, there by the original kitchen, walking over, I guess, to get in their cars. And I'm standing next to Verna Hoffman. That's Anna Hoffman's mom. And I said to her, Verna, I'm gonna marry that guy someday. She says to me, you are crazy. I said, yeah, but that's true. So meanwhile, I went to India, and I was with Lindsay Reiter, and we lived in the back of Vilu Villa in a little tiny house, and we worked with Goher. We worked for 6 months in that clinic, and we had bikes, and we rode from the bikes. This old guy was hanging out over there at the trust office. He and his mama, I have a picture with him and his mommy, and Lindsay and Lori, all standing there together with Mara Arani. And the only one that's living now is me, of all those women. But anyway, that's, what happened is, Goher, her hands, the softness of her skin, you know, the way she was, the humility, just, she, and all the other Mandalis, so something happened in me. I got a little more, you don't know it's happening to you, it sneaks in. Thank God it sneaks in, because we do so many things to kill it, you know. It got in, somehow got in his heart that was like a rock. Because I'd say to Mansari, there's all this love all over here, and I feel like a rock and nothing's going in. What do I do? She says, you just keep being a rock, and it'll happen. It's slow, but sure, you know? Anyway, to get on with it, I came back after being in India, and I went to the guest house, and I prayed in front of this picture, and I asked Baba again, I said, now look, I still have got myself on my own hands, but it's been beautiful in India, but I gotta get away to do something for you. And my dad was a minister, so I use that saying, an instrument of thy love. How do I become an instrument of thy love? And after begging, I'm saying begging, the idea of starting a school came into my head, a little preschool. And 2 days later, I was in Race Path, which is now off of Grissom Highway, near Grissom Parkway. I was walking down the street, this dirt street, and there was 2 little girls standing in the gutter in their little white slips. You know, you used to wear little white slips under your dresses, and they slept in those slips, and they were standing there, and I just knew that was where the school was going to be. I went in their little shack with them, and their grandma loved snuff. Her name was Mary. And she asked me if I'd go get her some snuff at the store, and I said, yeah, I'll do that. But on the wall was a picture of John F. Kennedy and Jesus. It was really beautiful.
Mary Leiter.
Mary Roberts. So, to tell you that story, Andy Lesnick and Andy's father gave us a house, and we moved it, people gambled in it in Cherry Grove, and we moved it down. Before the bypass was opened, they let us move it down the bypass. And the old guy, Mr. Altman, who moved houses and had moved stuff on the center, he was playing with my leg in the car. I was intimidated, you know what I'm saying? You have all these adventures when you're going on. And I was really happy when we got the house down there, and we put the house down and we named it Neighborhood House. And the day after we set it down, before we put the foundation in, you know how it's on big things, the guy whose land it was, who agreed for us to do it, came up to me, he says, you're gonna have to pay all this money. They called him Pork Chop. Pork Chop says, Mary, you're gonna have to pay all this money every month. Well, we didn't have the money. So I had to go tell Elizabeth. And this is what Elizabeth said to me. I'm gonna teach you how to be a businesswoman. That, and not in a bad way, but like, okay, we had no lease, we had to move the thing. So Elizabeth came down to Race Path, and she went all around and tried to find another piece of land. And I went to one family and I asked them, can we have some land from you for a certain amount of time and lease it and pay you rent? And they said, we're gonna pray on this, and tomorrow you come back. And they let us put the house on their land. And John, what did she do with the lease this time? Before it was word of mouth, right?
So we went to Elizabeth and said, well, they're letting us put the house on their land. So it meant that we had to get the mover back out and lift up the house and move it one lot over.
500 feet or, you know, not very far.
Not very far, but not very cheap either. And so we didn't, but now we've learned that we need to have a lease, something in writing. And we didn't know even how to begin thinking about what rent do we pay. So we went to Elizabeth and said, how do we figure out what the right rent is? We don't know. And she thought about it a minute and she came up with this. She said, well, in the first 5 years, you're not, it's all gonna be startup and you're just barely gonna be able to make your ends meet. So you're gonna ask that you keep the rent as low as possible during those first 5 years. That made sense. Then she said, but so if you make it your first 5 years, then you'll be established and you'll be able to pay the regular rental rate for it for the next 5 years. And we thought that made sense. And then she said, so if you make it now 10 years, you're doing okay, and now you have to pay him back for the rent you didn't pay him for those first 5 years. So you're gonna pay an extra amount for the last 5 years that you're there. And it made perfect sense. But this came from someone, I mean, I consider Elizabeth to be the example of all-knowing. I mean, that was what it was like with her. It was always she had a way of clarity and intuition that took you right to the point right away and helped you figure it out. But there are times that Mary and I actually didn't do it quite the way that Elizabeth wanted. The first way you heard about, well, Jane and allowing the workers for the swimming at the air base to stay on the center rent-free. The second time was Jane had this family in Pawleys Island that she had adopted, the Lee family, Etha Lee, and this family was just, you couldn't be more poor than this family, and Jane adopted them. And at some point she was able to get a mobile home for them. So we had to move the mobile home and get it set up. And the last part of actually moving it was getting a septic tank put in. So I'm talking to Jane about it, and I said, it's gonna cost $500, and CVS doesn't have that money. And she said, don't worry about it, the center will pay for it. And so I said, okay, this is coming from Jane, I just figure it's coming from the center. Well, we install the septic tank, I get the bill for $500, and so I dutifully and innocently take the bill to Elizabeth and say, here's the bill for $500, I need the check. Well, she looked at me, and I thought the ground was going to open, and it was going to, I was hoping it was going to swallow me. She said, you never do anything in the name of the center unless you hear it from me. Not Jane, not anyone. It has to come from me. But much like the air base, she said, but you've given your word, you committed the center, you shouldn't have, but you did, we're going to pay for it. So it got paid. And I somehow think Jane knew that that was going to happen, but it had to be me who asked, not Jane. Jane brought the passion. I mean, Jane was the energy of CVS, and she even said that there was nothing wrong with having passion on the spiritual path, that passion is part of the spiritual path. And when it came to the poor and the needy, there was no one who had more passion than Jane. But I want Mary to tell her story about when she asked Elizabeth for a raise.
I want to tell you a couple of things about Elizabeth that she said. She said, my real friends are my working friends. And you had that feeling when you were doing something together for Baba and you were working together on it. It was a wonderful energy. And she told me that she would lay in her bed at Del Ruba and look out her door, which is glass. If you go in there now, it's a sitting room, and there's glass, and she would look through the glass of the door and see the lake, and she'd pretend she was on a ship, on a cruise, because she loved to cruise. And one time, she would go always in the center in her station wagon and take stuff back to the cabins. And one day we were going back in together, and she was taking a frying pan that she had cast iron redone, and we took it back to the twin cottages. There was nothing that was wasted, and everything was taken care of. So she would tell me how wonderful it was to be on these cruises, and that there's a white chair on the treehouse, not the treehouse, but another cabin, I can't think of it. And it's from a cruise ship when she and Jane were on a cruise. You know, she would think about it all the time, and, well, this is really relaxing, I'm gonna bring this chair back, and people are gonna enjoy sitting in this chair. So it was lovely that way. And she said to me several times, you can't afford, and this is to all of us, to not take a vacation. You can't work that hard without taking time to do the work. And I thought that was really a wonderful thing to say, and I'm saying it to the daddy of Samuel, right there, Ben. So one time I had this little red Beetle, you know, those Beetles back in the day, those cars.
VW.
A VW. And my dad and mom gave it to me. It was $250. And because of the flea market, all these different businesses were involved, and they liked us, and so they would try to help us out, and they'd give us stuff. Every year we had a car to auction off. We had all kinds of stuff. We had artists sitting in there drawing pictures while people were in the flea market. You know, they were having their portraits done or something. So it was really cool. But I had the cook from Neighborhood House, and as you see that brochure going around, Neighborhood House became a school. In order to get federal funding, we had to bring 5 centers together in Loras and all over the Little River and all over. We had to create an association, and we got the first federal funding for Horry County that we've ever had. And the school flourished, and at night it was, or after school, it was a community center. And all the Baba women came down there and they taught knitting and sewing and all kinds of crafts. And you know, people were down there all the time. There was all this stuff happening. And the beautiful part about Neighbor House was it was run by the community. It wasn't run by white people coming in. It was us working together. And they hired the teachers, and we, in order to hire the teachers, and get the federal funding, we had to train them, right? They had to have some kind of training for licensure. So I went out to Coastal Carolina University, and I ran into Dr. Sally Hare, and she and I made up this certificate program. And all those women from the neighborhood that got hired by their own board became teachers, had for the first time health insurance, and it was transformative. And those two little girls, Tisha and Teresa, were the inspiration, the children of that school. And as you see the brochure going around, there was two little boys that were in that school, that one was 3 and one was 4, and they were so angry already. They were so filled with anger, and they were so beautiful, that I would say to Baba, there has to be a way to help this release into something creative. How can this be so already here, so strong? And that led me on to the next thing later on of being trained as a developmental therapist away from there. So Neighborhood House kept going, and it was wonderful, and out of it came many things. But the certificate program that got those moms that job and built that whole level of raising them out of poverty and the leaders of their community eventually became a 2-year associate degree program in the state of South Carolina and all over the country. And so now those same workers from all those churches and places can get a 2-year degree that's paid for mostly by our state and by federal funds, and they can go on to a 4-year degree. And we built the program at Horry Georgetown. I was in a program with many others, and that's what happened. But back to going to Elizabeth and saying, look, I was making $250 a month. The cook sat in my VW and the seat broke and it fell on the ground. Now we had to go get the food and stuff, and so I just needed a little extra money, you know, to pay for that. And I went to Elizabeth, and we sat down in Del Ruba in the living room, and she put her knees, and she made me sit in a chair with my knees touching her knees. And she looked right in my eyes, and I had to look in hers, and she said, if you want money, go to business school. That was it. Go to business school.
If you want to make money.
If you want to make money, you go to business school.
So the raise from $250 a month was.
Never happened. But that meant I had to get weekend work, right? So I went to the one and only, who was it? Laura Delaby. Walter might have been working with Laura, living with Laura at the time. Yeah, but anyway, Laura said, okay, you can clean my house on the weekends, and you can work in my garden. So with that extra money, I was able to, you know, make ends meet. And being around Laura was a gift beyond belief. So what else can I tell you?
Well, let's do the show and tell.
Okay, now I passed the brochure around, and this is a book of all the flea markets and lots of the stuff from CVS. It doesn't belong to us, so we've marked it, but we hope you don't open it and take things out. We need to acknowledge that when we first came to the center, Phyllis would have us to her house for teas. She would take all the stragglers from off the street and have us and talk to us and share with us. And I don't know how you all did it, but there was a place to go always to Phyllis and Lynn Ott's house. And we were very grateful because we were young. We didn't know anything. And in this between all these stories, we fell in love with each other. And the guy that I left in Minnesota came and asked me to marry him.
Okay, I'll take now.
This is true. He came down and he asked me to marry him. He was a beautiful Jewish guy too. And so John finds out he'd come. And I'm in my little house that I rented down there. And John comes over and he says, okay, you have to make up your mind by tomorrow. Let me know.
The rest is history. So in the what we're passing around, we marked some pages, but there's some photographs of people that you know that you might not recognize.
Walter's in there.
And so I'm just going to read a couple of slight from some of the newspaper articles that are in there. CVS, and this is March 1973, CVS held its monthly meeting Tuesday, March 20th at St. Andrew's Catholic Church. Ms. Peggy Waters was the new president. Other new officers are as follows. Vice President Mrs. Doretha Bowens, and she was from the community. Mrs. Ellie Schiller, and she was from the Jewish synagogue. Mrs. Mary Louise Garrison, who is Louise' mom.
Louise Crass' mommy.
Recording Secretary Mrs. Uta Bowman. Corresponding Secretary Mrs. Elizabeth Cheney. At the meeting, there were 3 additional board members, Mrs. Elizabeth Paterson, Mrs. Jane Haynes, and Mrs. Karen Joyner. And Karen, we've hopefully all had a teacher. She was a teacher at Myrtle Beach High. And hopefully we've all had a teacher like Karen Joyner, because she was that teacher that changed children's lives, or young people's lives, including our own path. But Charles and Wendy and Louise tell the same story about Karen Joyner. And then it goes on to say an advisory youth committee was established consisting of 4 members representing areas of CVS's interest